He was a man who had everything: money, power, and an empire built from the ground up. A billionaire with an untouchable reputation, feared in the boardroom and admired by men who wished they were him. But if you asked him, there was one thing in his life that didn't quite match his standards: his wife. She was beautiful, obedient, the perfect trophy to complete his image. But to him, she had one fatal flaw. She was illiterate. She couldn't read the contracts he signed, couldn't understand the financial reports he boasted about, and certainly couldn't hold a conversation about business. And oh, how he loved to remind her of that. With a smirk, a laugh, sometimes even in front of his friends. "What would you know? You can't even read the price tag on your own designer bags." And every time she lowered her gaze in embarrassment, he felt powerful. He thought he was untouchable, the king of his world, while she was just another pretty face in his shadow. But here's the funny thing about life. It has a way of turning the tables, because the same woman he mocked, the one he thought would always be beneath him, well, let's just say he had no idea what she was capable of. He was a man who had everything: money, power, and an empire built from the ground up. A billionaire with an untouchable reputation, feared in the boardroom and admired by men who wished they were him. But if you asked him, there was one thing in his life that didn't quite match his standards: his wife. She was beautiful, obedient, the perfect trophy to complete his image. But to him, she had one fatal flaw. She was illiterate. She couldn't read the contracts he signed, couldn't understand the financial reports he boasted about, and certainly couldn't hold a conversation about business. And oh, how he loved to remind her of that. With a smirk, a laugh, sometimes even in front of his friends. "What would you know? You can't even read the price tag on your own designer bags." And every time she lowered her gaze in embarrassment, he felt powerful. He thought he was untouchable, the king of his world, while she was just another pretty face in his shadow. But here's the funny thing about life. It has a way of turning the tables, because the same woman he mocked, the one he thought would always be beneath him, well, let's just say he had no idea what she was capable of. In the grand halls of their mansion, lined with chandeliers worth more than most people's entire savings, she walked silently, her footsteps barely making a sound on the marble floors. She had learned to make herself invisible, to smile when required, to sit quietly at events where he shined. She was his wife, yes, but in reality, she was just an accessory, something to be displayed, not heard. But inside her, a fire was burning, a fire he had unknowingly ignited with every taunt, every dismissive glance. Every moment he reduced her existence to nothing more than a pretty face. The breaking point came at an event, one of those high society gatherings where men talked business and women talked about shopping. But this time something was different. Someone handed her a document, a simple piece of paper that required her signature, a formality. But when she looked at it, her hands trembled. The letters on the paper were a puzzle she couldn't solve. She glanced up, hoping for help, but instead she saw his smirk, a slow, cruel smirk that told her everything she needed to know. He knew. He had done this on purpose. And when he laughed, loud, confident, mocking, his friends laughed with him. "Darling, do you need me to read it for you?" he teased. The humiliation burned into her skin like fire. That night, she locked herself in her room and stared at her reflection. Who was she? A woman trapped in a golden cage? A joke in the eyes of the man she had given her life to? Not anymore. That was the night she made a decision. She would never let him humiliate her again. What he didn't know was that his wife had a mind sharper than he ever gave her credit for. She found a tutor, someone discreet, someone who wouldn't laugh at her. Every night after he fell asleep, she studied. She traced letters with her fingers, whispered words under her breath, read newspapers, business books, anything she could get her hands on. At first it was a struggle, frustrating, slow, but she had something more powerful than intelligence: determination. Months turned into years, and while he remained blind in his arrogance, she evolved. She not only learned to read and write, she learned to understand the business world he so proudly ruled over. She studied his empire from the shadows, paying attention to his strengths, his weaknesses, the cracks in the foundation of his success. And those cracks, oh, they were growing. Because while she was learning, he was slipping. His arrogance led him to make reckless decisions, bad investments, ignoring advice. His empire, once unshakable, started showing signs of collapse. And for the first time in his life, he needed help. Desperate, he turned to the very people who had once praised him, the board members, the investors, the men who had once looked up to him as the ultimate businessman. But there was a problem. They had lost faith in him. His empire was crumbling, and he had no one left to save him. No one, except her. When she walked into that boardroom, heads turned. She had always been in the background, silent, unseen. But today she was different. Dressed in power, carrying herself with confidence, she walked past him without a glance and took her seat at the head of the table. The same woman he had once mocked now held the solution to saving his empire. With a calm, steady voice, she laid out her plan, a plan so precise, so brilliant, that the men in the room sat in stunned silence. She knew the business inside and out, better than he ever had. And when she finished, the decision was unanimous. The board made their choice. She was the new CEO. As he sat there speechless, reality hit him like a storm. The woman he had once belittled, the woman he had treated as nothing more than an accessory, was now his superior. His empire was in her hands. For the first time in his life, he felt small. He tried to apologize, tried to explain, but she wasn't the same woman he had married. She listened, but there was no desperation in her eyes, no need for his validation. She had outgrown him. And though she forgave him, one thing was clear. She was no longer living in his shadow. As she led the company to new heights, her story spread. Women looked up to her. She became a symbol of resilience, a testament to the power of self-growth. And he became a cautionary tale, a man who underestimated the very person who had the power to change everything. Because here's the truth. You can mock someone, belittle them, treat them as if they are nothing, but if they have determination, if they have the fire to rise, one day they might just become the person you have to answer to. But wait, you haven't subscribed to our channel yet, so make sure to subscribe for more. As the days passed, the billionaire found himself grappling with a reality he had never imagined. His once unshakable empire was now being rebuilt, but not by him. The woman he had dismissed as insignificant was now the face of his company, the one making the decisions, the one commanding the respect of the very people who once laughed at her alongside him. At first, he convinced himself that it was temporary, that she was just a figurehead, a symbol to please the board, and that soon he would be back in control. But the more he watched, the clearer it became. She wasn't just playing the part, she was thriving. Meetings that used to bore her, now she dominated them. The financial reports he used to wave in front of her as a joke, now she analyzed them with precision. The business world that he had always kept just out of her reach, she had stepped into it, and she wasn't leaving. The media was quick to pick up the story. The rise of the CEO wife, from housewife to powerhouse. Suddenly, she was everywhere. News articles, interviews, even business panels where she was the keynote speaker. And while she spoke about leadership, perseverance, and learning from adversity, the world slowly began to piece together the hidden truth behind her success. The man who had once mocked her was now working under her. For the first time in his life, he felt something unfamiliar. Powerlessness. No amount of money, no connections, no charm could change the fact that he was no longer the most important person in the room. She was. And then came the moment that shattered him. A high-profile investor meeting, one of the biggest of the year. He sat there silent as she stood before the investors, presenting a vision for the company's future. They hung on to her every word. And then, the moment he had once thought impossible, an investor turned to him and asked, "What do you think, Mr. Chairman?" Not CEO, not leader, chairman, a title with no real power, a reminder that his reign was over. He swallowed his pride, forced to smile, and nodded. "I trust my wife's judgment." Because what else could he say? The same woman he had belittled for being illiterate had surpassed him in every way. And that was when he finally understood. He had never been the smartest person in the room. He had just been the loudest. And while he wasted years inflating his own ego, she had been quietly building something greater. His empire hadn't just survived because of her. It had been saved by her. And as he watched her shake hands with billionaires, sign deals that would take the company to new heights, and walk past him without a second glance, he finally realized he had spent years underestimating the most powerful person in his life. And now, she didn't need him anymore. As the months went by, the shift in power became more evident. She wasn't just running the company, she was redefining it. Profits soared under her leadership, and she introduced bold strategies that he never would have considered. Competitors who once feared him now respected her. The same board members who once nodded at his every word were now waiting for her approval. And him, he had become a relic of the past. At first, he tried to find ways to reclaim his influence. He attempted to advise her, dropping hints in meetings, offering unsolicited suggestions. But she didn't need his advice. She had outgrown his lessons. Instead, she would listen politely, nod, and then make her own decision. He told himself he was proud of her, and maybe deep down, he was. But it wasn't just pride he felt, it was something else, something heavier, a feeling he had never experienced before: regret. Because now, every time he looked at her, he didn't just see his wife. He saw the woman he had underestimated. He saw the woman he had mocked, belittled, laughed at, and he saw the woman who had risen despite it all. One evening, as they sat across from each other in their lavish home, the silence between them was deafening. It wasn't the comfortable silence of a married couple who had shared years together. It was the silence of two people who had become strangers. Finally, he spoke. "You've changed." She looked up from the documents she was reviewing and met his gaze. Calm, composed, unreadable. "No," she said softly. "I just became the person I was always meant to be." There was no anger in her voice, no bitterness. And somehow, that hurt more than any argument ever could. For years, he had seen her as fragile, dependent, someone who needed him. But now, as he sat there, staring at the woman who had taken control of everything he once claimed as his own, he realized the truth. She had never needed him. He had needed her. And now it was too late. Days turned into weeks, and the distance between them only grew. She was busier than ever. Meetings, travel, press interviews. Her schedule was packed with high-stakes decisions, while his calendar, once overflowing with power moves, now felt empty. He tried to ignore it at first. He convinced himself that things would return to normal, that she would come back to him. But deep down, he knew. She was already gone. Not physically, not yet, but emotionally. She had left him the moment she found her own worth. One evening, as he walked past her office at home, he saw her sitting at her desk, completely focused. Papers, contracts, and reports were spread in front of her, things that once would have overwhelmed her. But now she was in control. He knocked on the doorframe. "You're working late." She didn't look up. "I have a lot to handle." A pause, he hesitated before stepping inside. "I was thinking, maybe we could have dinner together. Just us. Like old times." This time she did look up, and for the first time in a long while, he saw something in her eyes that terrified him: indifference. "I can't," she said simply. "I have a flight in the morning. There's an investor meeting in London." He swallowed. "Then maybe when you get back." She gave him a small, polite smile. The kind you give to a colleague, not a husband. "We'll see." And just like that, she was back to her work, dismissing him without saying a single harsh word. That was what hurt the most. Because he could handle anger. He could handle a fight. He had always been prepared for a dramatic confrontation, a moment where she would break down and shout at him for the years of humiliation. That he could deal with. But this quiet, effortless detachment, she had moved on, while still being right in front of him. And for the first time in his life, the billionaire, the man who once had everything, felt like he had nothing at all. The house, once filled with the sound of his voice, now echoed with silence. She was always busy, always somewhere else. And even when she was home, it felt like she was a guest passing through, A woman who had built an empire but left him behind in the process. He told himself it was just a phase, that the distance between them could still be closed, that one day she would walk through that door and smile at him like she used to, with warmth, with admiration, with love. But that day never came. Instead, something else arrived. Divorce papers. He stared at them in disbelief, his hands gripping the pages as if holding them tighter could change their meaning. This wasn't real. This couldn't be real. She walked into the room, calm as ever, dressed in a tailored suit, looking every bit the powerful woman the world now knew her as. "You don't have to do this," he said, his voice quieter than he expected. She sighed, not with anger but with certainty. "I do." He searched her face for any trace of hesitation, any flicker of doubt. There was none. "I never wanted to be your enemy," she continued. "I never wanted revenge. I just wanted respect. But I realized something. I don't need your validation anymore. I don't need to prove anything to you. I found myself, and in the process, I lost us." His throat felt dry. "I can change." She smiled, a soft, knowing smile. "Maybe, but I've already changed." She placed a pen beside the papers. "Sign them when you're ready." Then she turned and walked away, her heels clicking against the marble floors. The same floors where, years ago, she once walked in his shadow. Now she was walking away. And as the door closed behind her, he realized the painful truth. He had spent years trying to make her feel small. But in the end, she was the one who left him behind. He sat there staring at the divorce papers, his mind racing. He had once built an empire with ruthless precision, made deals that shattered competition, and yet here he was, unable to hold on to the one person who had truly mattered. The woman he had dismissed, mocked, and underestimated was now the one walking away from him. He thought about all the moments he had laughed at her, all the times he had waved away her opinions, treating her like she was nothing more than a beautiful decoration in his life. And now, she was the one people admired. She was the name investors trusted, the face of success, while he was just a man grasping at the remnants of his former power. He didn't sign the papers that night. He couldn't. Instead, he wandered through the empty halls of his mansion, the same mansion that once felt like a palace, but now felt like a prison. He glanced at the grand dining table where he used to hold extravagant dinners, the ballroom where they once danced in the early days of their marriage. Everything remained the same, except for her absence. He tried to tell himself that he could fix this, that if he just found the right words, if he just made the right gesture, she would come back. So he did what he had never done before. He humbled himself. The next morning, he showed up at her office unannounced, something he would have never done in the past. The employees looked surprised. After all, he was no longer the man in charge. He was escorted to her office, and when he walked in, he saw her standing by the window looking over the city she ruled. She turned, surprised but composed. "What are you doing here?" He hesitated. "I just wanted to talk." She nodded, gesturing for him to sit. But he didn't. Instead, he walked toward her, searching her face for any trace of the woman who once adored him, the woman he had taken for granted. "I was wrong about you." The words felt heavy, foreign, but they were the truth. "I was a fool, and I didn't see, no, I refused to see, how incredible you are." She didn't respond immediately. Instead, she studied him carefully, as if deciding whether his words carried any real weight. "Why are you telling me this now?" she finally asked. He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Because I don't want to lose you." A sad smile tugged at her lips. "You lost me a long time ago." His chest tightened. "We can fix this." She shook her head, not in anger, but with certainty. "You only want to fix this because you lost control. If I were still the woman you once mocked, still dependent on you, would you be here right now? Would you be apologizing?" He had no answer, because deep down, he knew the truth. She sighed. "I spent years believing I wasn't enough, that I wasn't worthy, and when I finally found my strength, I realized something. I was never the problem." Her words hit him like a blow, because she was right. She had never been the problem. He was. She leaned forward slightly. "I forgive you, But that doesn't mean I can forget, and it certainly doesn't mean I can go back. He felt his last bit of hope slip away. So that's it? She nodded. That's it. For the first time in his life, he truly understood what regret felt like. Not because he lost her, but because he had never valued her when it mattered. He didn't beg. He didn't argue. He simply nodded, his jaw clenched, his pride finally shattered beyond repair. And as he walked out of her office, past the employees who now answered to her, he realized something else. She was no longer his wife. She was his lesson. Days later, he finally picked up the pen and signed the divorce papers, not because he wanted to, but because he had no choice. She had already moved forward, and for the first time in his life, he had to accept that he was the one left behind. Her story became an inspiration. A woman who had once been mocked for being illiterate had risen to become one of the most powerful business leaders in the country. Women looked up to her, men respected her, and the world watched as she built something far greater than what he had ever envisioned. And him, he became a cautionary tale, a man who had everything, only to lose the one thing he never realized he needed most, her. Click on the profile pic to subscribe to our channel.